Parents chose my cheating ex over me, until he dumped them too. 3 months ago, the ground just went out from under me. Emily is me, and this is not a sob story for sympathy. This is the truth that tears you apart, leaving only pain and ashes. It all started with Jake. 5 years together, 5 years of late-night conversations, stupid jokes, and promises that I believed like the last fool. He wasn't perfect, but I thought we were solid. Brick by brick, I built my life around him, thinking he was holding it together. But it turned out that he had been holding a sledgehammer for a long time. I found out that he was cheating. Not a suspicion, not a hunch, evidence that could not be denied. The text popped up on his phone while he was showering. Last night was a fire, waiting for a new meeting, from a certain Tara. Everything inside him was cut short, as if someone had stabbed him in the stomach. My hands were shaking, and I flipped through months of lies, photos, plans. A double life, and I was blind, I didn't see anything. That evening I had a showdown. I was crying, running around the apartment, and he was sitting there cold, calm, lying so smoothly, as if he had been preparing for this all his life. The phone flew at him, missing his head by a hair. I barely restrained myself from screaming until I lost my voice. I told him to get out. He took his jacket, smiled, so brazenly that I can still see it in my mind, and left. I thought this was the bottom. I was wrong. 2 days later, a real blow came. I called my mom, barely able to control myself, and told her everything, the betrayal, the lies, his look as if I were nothing. I expected anger, warmth, at least some words. Instead, there was silence and then an exasperated sigh. Like, it's my fault, Jake is a good guy, I have to put up with it. My head was spinning with shock. My dad picked up the phone, grumbled that Jake was promising, and that we shouldn't spoil everything over nothing. Little things. I hung up the phone, numb, staring into the void, as if I had to find an answer there. And then it got even worse. It was Saturday night, I was broken, lying on the couch, replaying every moment with him, looking for where I had missed. The phone rings, a message from my sister, Claire. A photo. My parents' dining room, warmth, laughter, and Jake at the table. His mom is serving him potatoes, his dad is pouring him a beer. A caption about the best boyfriend. The phone drops out of his hands, and his chest tightens to the point of pain. They didn't just protect him, they chose him. They simply crossed me, their daughter, out. I sat staring at that photo, and something cracked inside. Quietly, coldly, without drama. They didn't call, didn't ask how I was. Instead, they were having dinner with the man who crushed me, laughing, apparently, at my sensitivity. Jake didn't just betray me, he took my family away. I wanted to break in, kick down the door, scream until they heard me. But I stayed where I was, alone, in the suffocating silence. I couldn't sleep. I closed my eyes and there was his smug face, my mother's indifferent voice. Why him? What is it about him that makes me a stranger? Was it my fault or theirs? There were no answers. I didn't know then how deep it had gone. How everything would turn out to be a disaster for them. But that would come later. For now, there was only darkness, a broken heart, and a family that didn't need me. And the question of how to live with it. The week after that photo passed in a blur, but I was burning inside. Emily is me, and I couldn't just lie there and swallow this pain as if nothing had happened. The world moved on, and I was stuck, torn between anger and a question that gnawed at my brain, why? Why did my parents choose Jake, that slippery deceiver, over me? The answer didn't lie on the surface, but I knew something wasn't right. So I started digging, even though every find felt like a knife in the back. At first, it all seemed pointless. I replayed in my head every conversation with my mom and dad over the past months. Their hints, their strange pauses, the way they praised Jake for every little thing. He bought a new suit, genius. He changed his car, a future millionaire. I laughed then, thinking they just loved him like a son. But now it looked different. Too much praise, too much warmth for a guy who turned out to be rotten to the bone. And then I remembered one thing, a random phrase from my dad a couple of months ago. Like, Jake had promised to help with their house, something about fixing the roof. It had slipped my mind at the time, but now it all fit together like a puzzle that made me sick. I went to their house. Not to talk, I couldn't look them in the eye without falling apart. I just stood across the street, hiding behind a tree like a spy in a bad movie. And I saw his car. Jake was there, again. My heart was pounding so fast I could barely breathe. They walked out onto the porch. He was wearing an expensive shirt, my dad was clapping him on the shoulder, my mom was smiling like it was Christmas. And then he handed them an envelope. It was thick, white, and definitely not a postcard. It was money. Everything fell into place, and it made me want to scream. My parents sold me for his dirty handouts. I returned home, my legs were shaking, my head was chaos. I sat down on the floor, among the scattered things that still smelled like him, and started to remember. Jake always bragged about his connections, his job, his plans for big business. I thought it was empty talk, but to my parents it must have sounded like a gold mine. They had never been rich, my dad had bent his back at the factory all his life, my mom sewed to order, and they barely made ends meet. And then Jake, smooth and confident, promises to help, to pull them up to a better life. And I became redundant. Their daughter, their blood, against his shiny promises. They chose him because he smelled like success and I smelled like a burden. But that was not all. The next day I received a message from Claire, my sister. It was short, seemingly casual, but every word hit like a nail. She wrote that Jake was now part of the family, that he had paid off his dad's car debts. Debts I didn't even know about. Everything spun before my eyes. He hadn't just bought their loyalty, he had cemented it, as if he had signed a contract. And me? I was what was given in exchange. My tears, my pain were a small price to pay for their peace of mind. At that moment, I felt invisible, as if I had been erased from their lives in one movement. My anger was boiling, but behind it was something worse, understanding. They didn't just choose him because of his betrayal. They chose him long ago, before Tara, before everything fell apart. Every dinner where he sat at our table, every praise, was a calculation. Cold, quiet, ruthless. I was blind, trusting, loving, and they were already trading me for his promises. And when the truth came out, when I became a threat to their deal, they turned away as if I were a stranger. That night, I lay in bed, looking at the ceiling, and felt everything inside shrink. I wanted to bust in on them, tell them everything I knew, shatter their little world with Jake. But I stopped myself. Because I realized they didn't deserve my vote. Not yet. Let them enjoy their hero, let them hold on to their lies. I knew it wasn't over. Jake is not who he says he is, and his mask will fall off sooner or later. And when it does, I'll be ready. Not for revenge, although, damn, I want to, but to see them reap what they've sown. At the time, I didn't know how close that moment was. I didn't see that someone who knew Jake better than I did was already waiting around the corner. But I felt something was coming. And that made my heart beat faster, even though it hurt more than ever. The week after I realized that I had been sold for an envelope of money was hell. Emily was me, and I was drowning in this pain, as if in mud from which I could not get out. Anger drove me forward, but loneliness strangled me, leaving me without air. My parents chose Jake, my sister sang odes to him, and I became a ghost in my own family. All I had was an apartment where his scent still lingered, and thoughts that tore my head apart. But I wasn't going to give up. If they thought I would just disappear, they were very wrong. The first thing I did was try to prove the truth. Not to them, no, I knew that their eyes were closed to everything but his false promises. I wanted to shout to the world, to show them who he really was. I found Tara on social media, not hard when you know her name and have seen her face in those photos. A girl with bright lips and empty eyes who boasted about expensive gifts. I wrote to her. My hands were shaking as I typed the message, short, direct, without tears. I told her that I knew about her and Jake, that he had lied to both of us. I waited for a response as if my life depended on it. She read it. And nothing. Nothing. Then I saw that I was blocked. The first blow. Then I went to mutual friends. People with whom we drank coffee, laughed at parties, shared silly stories. I thought at least someone would understand and take my side. I was wrong. One of them brushed me off, saying that he didn't want to meddle in other people's business. Another said I was being dramatic, that Jake was not like that. The third simply stopped answering. Each blow hit harder than the last. Everyone saw him as the same hero my parents had bought for me: successful, charismatic, flawless. And I became a madwoman who couldn't let go. Loneliness hit me like a wave, cold and heavy. The nights became the worst. I lay in the dark, listened to the silence that was buzzing in my ears, and thought, maybe I'm the one who is broken. Maybe they are right, and I just can't see. But then I remembered his smile as he walked away, that envelope in my father's hands, my mother's indifferent voice. No, it's not me who's crazy. They are the ones who are blind. And I decided not to stop. If my friends turned away, if my family rejected me, I would find another way. I started looking deeper. I looked through his old messages that I hadn't deleted yet, looking for clues. I found a mention of a project, something big he was planning with someone named Marcus. The name didn't mean anything, but I clung to it like a straw. Days passed, and I dug further. I wrote to old chats, Googled his name, even found a couple of articles about his successful startup. Everything looked perfect, too perfect. Something stank, but I couldn't put my finger on it. One thing kept running through my mind: if I proved him to be a fraud, everything would fall apart. My parents would see who he was, and their little world with him would shatter like glass. But there was no evidence. Only hints, fragments, feelings. And a loneliness that grew like a shadow in the corner. And then a strange thing happened. Late at night, when I was sitting with my laptop, turning the next page, someone knocked on the door. Quietly, hesitantly, as if they didn't want to be heard. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't expecting anyone. I opened the door, and there was a man standing there. He was thin, wearing an old jacket, with eyes that saw more than I could imagine. He didn't introduce himself, just said one sentence that sent a chill down my spine. He knew Jake. And he knew something that could change everything. Before I could ask more, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving me with my mouth open and my pulse pounding in my temples. That night I didn't sleep again. Who was he? Why did he come? What does he know? My thoughts were buzzing, mixing fear and hope. The loneliness receded for a moment, giving way to something new: a premonition. Jake is not as invulnerable as he seems. He has weaknesses, and I was getting closer to them, even though I didn't know where it would lead. My parents, my sister, my friends, everyone turned away, but now I wasn't completely alone. Someone there, in the shadows, knew the truth. And I had to find it, even if it crushed me completely. After that nightly knock on the door, everything changed. Emily was me, and I was on the threshold of something big, even if I didn't know where it would take me. The loneliness was still gnawing at me, but now there was a spark in it, something sharp that drove me forward. The man in the old jacket didn't just scare me, he threw me a thread, thin and shaky, but I grabbed it with both hands. Jake was no longer the invulnerable god my parents saw him as. He had cracks, and I was going to break them. The next day I waited for him to come home, but he didn't. Instead, the one sentence he'd thrown out before he disappeared into the darkness kept running through my head. He knew Jake, not just knew, but had a grudge against him. You could hear it in his voice, low and sharp like a blade. I couldn't sit idly by. I remembered the name Marcus from those old messages from Jake. I started searching again, this time with renewed vigor, like a hunter picking up a scent. Google, social media, old contacts, everything came into play. And she found him. Marcus Evans, Jake's former business partner, whom he threw out when the startup started bringing in the first money. An article about a lawsuit, an old post on social media with angry accusations. Everything matched, the thin, tired look, the same cold stare. It was him. I met him 2 days later. I didn't expect him to find me, but he did, in a coffee shop where I was hiding from the world with a cup of cold coffee. He sat down across from me uninvited, put his hands on the table, and I saw the scars on his fingers, old, rough, as if from a struggle. He wasted no time in being polite. Jake, he said, had stolen everything from him, his idea, his money, his future. He promised a partnership, and then threw it away like garbage when he was successful. But that was not all. Marcus knew more, about how Jake built his empire. Fake deals, fake clients, lies that hung by thin threads. My parents bought the smoke, not the gold. And these threads were beginning to break. My heart was pounding as he spoke. Everything I had suspected was becoming real, but now it was frightening. Marcus was not a friend, his eyes burned with hatred, not for me, but for Jake, and I was just a tool. He gave me a key, the name of the company Jake was using to launder money. He said that if I dug deeper, I would find evidence. But he warned me that if it came out, it wouldn't just be Jake who would go down. My parents, who took his handouts, would also be in the mud. I nodded, even though my insides were cramping. He left without saying goodbye, leaving me with a name on a napkin and the feeling that I was holding a grenade without a receipt. That night I didn't sleep again. I sat with my laptop, looking for that company. And I found it. It was a small company registered to a fictitious person, but Jake's name was in the documents, in small print, hidden among a pile of legal junk. It all started to come together. He wasn't just lying to me or my parents, he was playing something bigger, more dangerous. And my parents, blinded by his promises, became part of it. They took money without asking where it came from. My anger was mixed with fear. I wanted to destroy his world, but what would happen to them? Those who betrayed me but were still my family. The next day I saw them by chance. I was driving past their house. I don't know why I turned there, my feet must have taken me there. They were standing in the yard, laughing, and Jake was next to them, in a new car, shiny like a trophy. Mom was holding some kind of package, and Dad looked happier than ever. Everything was bought with his lies. There was a lump in my throat, but I didn't stop. I drove on, gripping the steering wheel so hard that my knuckles turned white. They didn't know that I knew. They didn't know that I held the thread that could unravel everything. And they didn't know about Marcus. That day ended with a new plan. With or without Marcus, I would go all the way. Jake hadn't just betrayed me, he had stolen from everyone who trusted him, and my parents were next in line to fall. But doubts gnawed at me. Am I ready to pull this thread, knowing that it will destroy more than just him? Will I be able to watch them lose everything they bought for my betrayal? There was no answer, but I felt the time was coming. And when it comes, someone will have to pay. Or maybe everyone. The days after meeting Marcus flew by like a fever. Emily was me, and I held the thread that could unravel everything Jake had so carefully built. My heart was pounding with anticipation, but my chest was cold. I knew that once it started, there would be no turning back. My parents, blind and greedy, were mired in his lies up to their ears, and I couldn't decide whether I wanted to save them or watch them drown with him. But I couldn't stop any longer. Reckoning was coming, and I could smell it in the air. It all started with a call. Marcus sent a short message, 3 words that turned the world upside down. Jake's firm was falling apart. He didn't explain the details, but I rushed to find out for myself. I opened my laptop, flipped through the news, social media, everything that could give me an answer. And I found it. It was a small article, hidden among the financial reports, but it was as poisonous as a snake bite. The company he was laundering money through had gone under. Clients filed lawsuits, investors disappeared, and the tax authorities started digging. His empire was bursting at the seams, and that was just the beginning. For the first time in months, I felt something like triumph, albeit mixed with bitterness. Then I saw him. I was driving through town when I spotted his car, the same shiny little thing he'd been bragging about to my parents. But this time, it was on the side of the road, and he was next to it, shouting into the phone, waving his arms. His face was red, his shirt crumpled, and he had no smoothness or confidence. He looked like a cornered animal, and I couldn't take my eyes off him. I drove by, but my heart was pounding. It was him, the real one, without the mask. Jake, who had promised everyone gold, was now standing alone, and his world was crumbling like sand. And then came the news from Claire. Her sister called for the first time in weeks, her voice trembling as if she was afraid to speak. She said that Jake had disappeared. He doesn't answer the phone, doesn't come to his parents, he just vanished. My mom is crying, my dad is hysterical, their savior has abandoned them, just like he abandoned me. Everything he promised, repairs, debts, stability, turned out to be smoke. My parents were left with nothing but an empty house and a pile of bills he was never going to pay. Claire begged me to come and help, but I was silent. I hung up the phone without saying a word. Their choice had boomeranged back on them, and I felt no regret, only a cold emptiness. I went to their house that evening. I didn't go in, I just stood across the street, just like when I saw the envelope. But this time the light in the windows was dim, no laughter, no warmth. Dad was sitting on the porch, his head in his hands, and Mom was pacing back and forth, nervously clutching her phone. They looked broken, and I knew why. Jake hadn't just disappeared, he'd taken everything he could with him. I checked his social media, his account was dead, deleted, as if it had never existed. But I knew he was out there, licking his wounds, looking for a new victim. And my parents? They were left with the wreckage of his lies, and I couldn't decide if it was justice or just another blow. That night I came home and turned on the TV. By chance, I came across a report, a financial scandal, no names were mentioned, but I recognized the details. Fake deals, shell companies, fraud worth millions. Jake didn't just fall, he took everyone who believed him down with him. And my parents, who had sold me for his promises, were now standing among the ruins. Marcus was right, when it came out, everything burned. But I didn't feel joy. Only fatigue, heavy as a stone in my chest. The phone rang again. It was my mom. Her number flashed on the screen, and I looked at it without moving. Memories were spinning in my head, how she served him potatoes, how my dad laughed at his jokes. And then, her indifferent voice when I begged for support. She did not answer the phone. Let them talk to me in silence, as I had talked to their betrayal. But something cracked inside, not anger, not pain, but something deeper. They had lost everything, and I knew they would come to me. Not today, but soon. And I didn't know what I would do when it happened. Jake fell. My parents fell with him. And I stood by, looking at the ashes of their choice. Was it a victory? Or was it just another wound? There was no answer, but I felt it was not the end. Something else was coming, and I had to be ready. The days after Jake's fall dragged on slowly, as if time was frozen in a thick fog. Emily is me, and I stood in the middle of this chaos, feeling everything I knew crumble into dust. His empire of lies had collapsed, my parents were left empty-handed, and I was left with a heart that ached but no longer bled. Reckoning came, but it did not bring peace. Instead, there was a choice I hadn't expected, and it weighed on me like a stone pulling me down. I ignored the first call from my mom, but they didn't stop. The phone buzzed every hour: Mom, Dad, even Claire. The voicemails piled up, and I couldn't bring myself to listen to them. I knew what I would hear: tears, pleas, excuses. They'd lost everything they'd bought with his promises, and now they were thinking of me, their daughter, who they'd cut out for him. But I was in no hurry. I sat in the silence of my apartment, stared at the wall and thought, why should I save them? Why should I reach out to those who pushed me away when I was drowning? Finally, she turned on one message. My mom's voice was shaking, breaking down into sobs. She was asking me to come, saying that they had made a mistake, that Jake had deceived them all. Dad was shouting in the background, his anger mingled with helplessness. Claire added her own, short and quiet, as if she were ashamed. It all sounded like an echo of what I had experienced myself: shock, pain, disappointment. But where were they when I begged them to believe me? Where were they when I stood alone against his lies? The message ended, and I felt the anger that had been simmering for so long give way to something else: pity. Not for them, but for myself, who was still waiting for warmth from them. I went to their house not because I decided to forgive them. I just wanted to see it. I stood across the street, as I had done before, and watched. The yard was empty, and my father's car was gone. He must have sold it to pay off his debts. The windows were dark, not a sound. Then the door opened and my mom came out. Thin, hunched over, as if she had aged 10 years. She saw me, froze, and then rushed across the street, stretching out her arms. I stepped back. Her eyes were filled with tears, but I couldn't bring myself to hug her. My dad came out after me, shouting my name, but I turned and walked to the car. Their voices echoed behind me, but I didn't stop. Not yet. That night I lay in bed and thought about Jake. He had disappeared, but I knew he was out there somewhere, coming up with a new scheme, looking for new fools. His fall didn't break him, it just exposed him. And my parents? They were broken. Everything they had built on his lies had fallen apart, and now they stood in front of the wreckage, begging me to glue their lives back together. But I wasn't ready. I couldn't decide whether I wanted to be their savior or just walk away, leaving them with what they deserved. The next day I received a letter. An old, yellowed envelope with no return address. Inside was a short note from Marcus. 2 words: "You did it." And that was it. No explanation, no goodbye. He disappeared, just like Jake, but he left me with the feeling that I had accomplished something. Or had I? I had broken his lie, but what did I get in return? A family that betrayed me. Loneliness that became my shadow. Or maybe a strength I didn't know I had before. I sat on the floor, holding that note, and felt everything inside me shrink. I wanted to scream, cry, laugh all at once. Jake fell, my parents paid, but I didn't feel victorious. Only an emptiness that grew every day. And a question that had no answer: what to do next? Should I go back to them, forgive them, try again? Or should I leave them in the past, like they left me? The choice was right in front of my eyes, but I couldn't make it. Not that day. Finally, I got up, went to the window, and looked at the city. It was moving on, indifferent to my pain or their fall. And I realized that I had survived. Through betrayal, loneliness, anger. Jake didn't break me, my parents didn't destroy me. I was standing here, alive, and that was more than they could take away. But where to go? The door had closed behind one life, but a new one had not yet opened. And I knew the answer would come. Not now, but soon. In the meantime, I just breathed, feeling the strength returning to my hands.